Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and this is a companion video for the scarflette, the answer. This video will talk you through a bunch of tips and tricks so that you have success knitting the answer. The answer is like basically the answer to the perfect little scarflette, not to be redundant. So let me show you the construction of the answer. If you look down here, the answer is cast on at one tip with just 3 stitches, and then you're increasing along one edge until you get to the center point, and then decreasing down the other side until you get to the other tip. It is a super simple construction. The answer can be worked with fingering weight yarn and beads, or it can be worked with any other weight of yarn and no beads. I've got a little bonus for you in the pattern, and I've given you 2 versions of the pattern, one with beads and one without. If you're working with beads, you'll see beads are used in 2 ways. One, they're placed on stitches along that edge that has the increases and decreases. And then there are also pools of beads that are placed randomly. You get to use a 6-sided die for rolling the die to see exactly where those beads are going to be placed on beaded rows, which is super fun. I'm really excited to tell you about the yarn that I used to knit the answer. It made like the floofiest self-stripy rainbow kitten that feels yummy to wear. But before I tell you about that and all the other materials that you're going to need to knit the answer, I think it's important for me to tell you that you are going to need the pattern to follow along with this video. I give you a link to the pattern below. It is easy to purchase and download, and you'll need to follow along with that as I talk you through all these tips and tricks. So first thing, let's talk about what you're going to need to knit the answer. If you're in my small knitted kit club Lola's Choice, you got a kit to knit the answer. The yarn that was in your kit is this absolutely scrumptious yarn from Katia called Atiena. I believe that's how you pronounce this. It's called Atiena Tones, and it is a virgin wool cotton and cashmere blend. It has 18% cashmere in it, so you really feel the cashmere as you are working with it. It is a self-striping rainbow that has kind of these long color blocks, so you really get to play with each color as you get to it. Another thing that is in your kit is a bag of size 6 Japanese seed beads. All of the seed beads that are in your kit are Matsuno seed beads. These are some of my favorite seed beads. They've got a square hole with a silver lining and then different colors of glass. And I chose 6 different colors, the colors of the rainbow, that I thought really pop on this yarn beautifully. You'll also have a piece of super floss for placing those beads. You can also use a small like 0.8 millimeter or 1 millimeter crochet hook if you have one, or a beetle needle or a beading wire. And then the kit also includes a 6-sided die because you'll be rolling that die when it comes time to place the beads in those little pools that I showed you on the swatch scarf in the beginning. Other thing that you're going to need is needles to get gauge, and we'll talk about needles next. The pattern calls for US size 6 if you're working with fingering weight yarn. Now you can knit the answer with the supplies in your kit or any other fingering weight yarn and US size 6 beads, or you can knit the answer without beads, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later at the end of this video. If you are going to work with another yarn for your stash, and I think you'll find that this scarflette is the answer for a super quick giftable knit. See how I like snuck the answer in there? You will probably want to have some kind of portable digital scale for weighing your yarn so that you get the most out of that skein. We'll talk about that a bit towards the end of this video. So once you have all of your supplies to knit the answer, or you have your kit and you are ready to go, the next thing to do is to quickly talk about gauge before we talk more about how we're working with beads in this. Okay, gauge. I know you might be saying to yourself, but it's just a little scarflette. I don't need to do gauge. You don't want to run out of yarn when you are working your answer, especially if you're working the beaded answer from the kit with the kit yarn. I did end my answer with about 15% of the yarn left over, which all of my testers did as well, but we were all careful to get stitch gauge blocked before we cast it on our answers. So you will see that the gauge called for in the pattern, I give you two different gauges. I give you one gauge in garter stitch unblocked, and that is in the Katia Atiana yarn. And then I give you the gauge in pattern stitch blocked. So if you want to, for doing your gauge swatch, you can cast on your answer and work 4 or 5 inches and then block it and lay it down and take your gauge, or you can work a garter stitch swatch unblocked like I have under the camera. And you will see that I did not work a full 4-inch high swatch, but I did work a swatch that was more than 4 inches wide. And your goal is to get 17 stitches unblocked over 4 inches, which works out to about like 8.5 stitches over 2 inches. So I'm going to tell you that stitch gauge matters more than row gauge. So if you get stitch gauge, don't worry about row gauge. That's going to all work out in the wash. I always tell you with my patterns which is more important. And in this case, stitch gauge is more important. But you can choose if you want to work a garter stitch gauge swatch unblocked, check your gauge to make sure you're getting 17 stitches over 4 inches, and then rip it out and start knitting your shawl. Or if you want to cast on and work at least 4 or 5 inches and then stop and block that. If you're going to do that, you can just put it onto a piece of stitch saver or a piece of scrap yarn to go ahead and block it. That is totally up to you. What I will tell you is with this yarn, because it's got that cashmere floof to it, it's not as easy to rip out when you're going to rip it out. So if you work a gauge swatch and you don't get gauge and you're not happy with your fabric, you might end up deciding not to rip it out and just cut it and set it aside. I do believe you will have enough yarn in that skein, since we had a fair amount of yarn left over after knitting our answers. So that's everything you need to know about gauge. Please don't skip it. That's cheating. If you are working with another yarn, then I'm going to tell you, and we'll talk about this again a little later, you can go ahead and knit that yarn at the gauge you like it at best. And I'll be showing you one that I'm working on right now where I did adjust the gauge a little bit just so that I loved the stitches and the way the yarn was blooming. So you'll get to see that later on in this video. So now that we've talked about gauge, the next thing to talk about is how you can use your beads on your answer, and then we're going to jump right in and start knitting together. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about how beads are worked with in the answer, because you have a few different choices, and you'll see from my testers that they all used beads in a different way. Some did it like I did, some kind of went off on their own. So if you got a Lola's Choice kit, you got 6 different colors of beads, and I tried to include a somewhat equal amount of all 6 of those colors. So as you are working the edge stitches, you can either place those beads randomly, or you can place those beads in a random order. If you're working with beads from stash, you can kind of make your own bead mix. You can work with a single color of beads. That is completely your choice. But if you're working from the kit, you'll see that I went red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. What I will say is that in the kit, the orange and the yellow can be a little bit hard to tell apart depending on the light that you're in. Like if you're working at night, it might be a little hard to tell them apart. So as you're working with them, you might want to pour them out on a piece of white paper and just separate into orange and yellow piles if you're having a hard time seeing those two apart. So I did my beads on my edge in order. And then for your little pool of bling, you could do your pools of bling as you get to them. These are beads that are placed onto elongated stitches. So those are stitches where you're wrapping the yarn twice around the needle and then dropping that extra wrap on the next row. And I'll be showing you how to do that. You can place those beads where each pool of the beads is the same color. So you could have like a pool of red, a pool of orange. If you're working from stash, they could all be the same color. They can also just be a mix of beads where you're grabbing different color of beads, or you can be like me and build a full rainbow where you are placing purple, blue, or green, yellow, orange, red. That was very hard saying the rainbow backwards. I always do it in the other direction. That was like a little brain twister there. So you've got a lot of options when it comes to playing with beads. I would note that if you are working from a kit, you don't have enough beads of one color to do your whole edge in one color or to do all of your pools in one color. You are going to need to mix up amongst those 6 colors. I was just in a really rainbowy mood when I was deciding the answer, and I wanted to choose colors that just played so well with the yarn, the colors in the yarn that you got. So I hope you have fun with that. If you're stash diving for beads, I should mention that I used US size 6 beads. US size 6 beads have about 12-ish, 16-ish beads to the gram, and that'll give you an idea of how many beads you need to get going to knit your own answers. I'm very excited to see all of your versions of the answer that come out as you get creative working with color and working with yarns in your stash. So now we've talked about beads, how they are used on the pattern. The next thing for us to do is cast on together and work the setup rows. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to start with the left wing setup where you cast on, and we're going to work the first 8 setup rows together. And then I've got a little scarf further along to show you what that looks like after you have worked bodies, some rows of the left wing. So I am all set up underneath the camera to do a 3-stitch cast on. If you're familiar with any of my boomerang scarves, this is a cast on that I use often when I'm starting at the tip of a scarf. So I'm going to go ahead with my needle in my right hand, and I'm going to come underneath my yarn from the left to the right. And that's going to end up being the first stitch of the cast on. You can see when I do that, that stitch is getting twisted right there. And now I'm kind of set up to do the long tail cast on, and I'm going to come through those yarns that are going around my thumb, and I'm going to grab the yarn over my index finger, and I'm not going to let the yarns go, but I'm going to dive in again to those yarns in between my thumb and go around the yarn on my index finger again. And then I am going to let go and pull down, and you will see that I have 3 stitches on my right hand needle. If you've not done that cast on before, just go back and watch that a few times. You can slow down this video if you need to watch me to do it more slowly. You can speed it up if you want to see it a little bit more quickly. And now that's my cast on. So I'm ready to work setup row 1, and I am going to start with a knit 1 and a yarn over. Notice that my yarn over has the right leg to the front of the needle and the left leg to the back of the needle. And then I am going to knit 2. That first stitch you knit might want to get a little bit loose. You can see I just kind of tightened up on the tail as I was working it. And now I'm going to turn my work and work row 2, which is a knit 2, and then that next stitch is a knit 1 through the back loop. Whenever you see a work through the back loop stitch, that is always going into the yarn over, and that is twisting that yarn over so that it is making a left leaning increase. And now I am going to knit the next stitch. And now I am going to come, and I'm on row 3, and at the end of row 3 we get to place a bead together. So we're going to knit 2, and I'm going to yarn over, and then I'm going to purl 1, and now this last stitch is place a bead and purl. And I'm going to go ahead and use my 1 millimeter crochet hook. You can also use the super floss that came in your kit, and I will link to a video that teaches you how to do that if you've never done that before. Now I'm going to take that stitch, slide it off my left hand needle, slide that bead onto the stitch, put that stitch back onto the needle, and then knit one. And that is a PBK, or place bead knit. And now I'm on row 4, and I am going to purl 2, and then I'm going to purl 1 through the back loop, and then I'm going to slip those last 2 stitches purlwise with yarn in front. You're going to notice that from now on, the last 2 stitches of every wrong side row are always slipped. And now I'm on row 3, which should be quite comfortable for you. I'm going to knit 3. And then I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to knit 1, and I'm going to place a bead, and I'm going to find an orange bead next. And I'm going to slide that bead onto my needle, and then I'm going to go ahead and knit 1. And now I am on row 6, and I'm going to purl 1, and then I'm going to knit 1. And now I'm going to knit 1 through the back loop. Remember, that's the yarn over from the right side row, that increase. And now I'm going to knit 1 more and slip those last 2 stitches. Now this next row has something new. This is our elongated stitches row. So what I'm going to do is knit 1, and then I'm going to knit 1 wrapping yarn twice to the last stitch. And if you've never done this before, the biggest trick with working elongated stitches like this is that you wrap your yarn around the full width of your needle, not just up at the tip, because then they're going to get really small on your needles. And then I am going to wrap 2, and that last stitch, I'm going to do a place bead knit. So I'm going to go get a yellow bead because I just need to do my beads in rainbow order. I can't have it any other way, it seems. And then I'm going to knit that stitch. And now once I show you row 8, you've kind of learned everything in the pattern except for the little beading trick that we'll go over. So now what I'm going to do is, as I work across this row, I'm going to drop my extra wraps. So I'm purling across the row, and as I get to those elongated stitches, I'm just going into one leg of that stitch and dropping the extra wrap. And what that does is make a stitch with an exaggerated length, which is kind of ends up looking like faux lace. It's very, very easy. It's not lace because you're not doing increases and decreases to make it. And then those last 2 stitches, you're just going to slip those 2 stitches with the yarn in front. So in those 8 rows, you have learned every stitch in this pattern. There's one at the very, very end, which is a center double decrease. And then I guess the stitch when you decrease back down is a knit 2 together, but I'm sure you know how to do that, as that is a very basic stitch. So this is through rows 8. If I go ahead and grab what this looks like after you've worked 2 repeats of the left wing, you really get an idea of what the shaping of this piece looked like. So those first 3 beads on the edge right there are set up rows 1 through 8. The next 3 beads are 1 repeat of rows 1 through 6 of the left wing. Those next 3 beads are the next repeat. So it's really easy to tell what row you're on by how many beads you have placed. If it helps you, you can leave a stitch marker every so often so that you're not counting back to the beginning to see how many repeats you've worked or how many beads you have. But I have written this pattern so that if you are working with a rainbow repeat to the center, that you are placing those in sets of 6 so that you will end with a purple bead, the end of the rainbow, when you get to the very center of the answer before you start to decrease down for the right wing. So that should tell you most about that. The next thing I want to talk about is how you decide about placing those pools of bling. So let's go ahead and do that next. All right, so I have a swatch under the camera here that is at the very end of row 41, because row 42 is our first beaded row with that pool of bling. And I just wanted to show you kind of what it looks like to work the elongated stitches with this gorgeous Atiena yarn so you can see how beautiful they are. And then we'll talk about the beading on the next row. So I'm at the last stitch and I'm doing a place bead and then knit. And then we are on row 42. And those of you who have ever read or listened to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy know that the number 42 is the answer to like the universe and something else and everything. I forgot the exact words of my quote there. I should ask my cameraman because I'm sure he remembers them. But 42 is a very special number because it is the answer and it is your first beaded row. So it is part of why this pattern is called the answer when I realized that row 42 was the first beaded row. Now, what you're going to do is you'll see every time that you have a beaded row that your beaded row will say, work a beaded row, C notes. And then it'll say roll die and multiply the number of the die by either 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So I'm on my first beaded row, my first row 42. So I'm going to roll my die and I got a 5. So that means I am going to start my beading on row 10, which I believe will work. I'm just going to, on stitch 10. I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Remember that these are our double wraps, right? And then the next 6 stitches are going to get beads on them. So I am going to purl 1, and now I'm going to purl 10, dropping my extra wraps. So I purl 9 more, so it's 10 total. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I do think it is important to say that if you don't like the number you rolled, you can always roll again. And now it is time for me to start that pool of bling. And I'm going to start it with red beads. You could start it with the other end of the rainbow and start with purple beads. That is completely up to you. I am going to drop those wraps and then place 2 beads onto that stitch and then go ahead and purl that stitch. And I'm going to continue doing that for 6 stitches. You can place your beads in the order of a rainbow. You can place them randomly. That is absolutely your choice. You are in charge of your answer right here. And that is how easy it is to place those beads in those little pools of bling. Isn't that fun? Such a good time doing that. So now you know how to place your beads, how to work with beads on the edge, why I gave you a 6-sided die just for a little bit of extra fun. If you don't have a die on hand or you don't feel like using it, you can just kind of purl a bit into the row, making sure that you're placing those beads over 6 stitches and then keep going. So you will continue on working the left wing until you get to the center, and then you will start to decrease back down for the right wing. Let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk about doing an answer without any beads. Okay, I don't have any other knitting to show you. When you work that right wing, you are decreasing back down. The last stitch is a center double decrease. I do have an old video that I can tag for you if you've never worked a center double decrease before. It is explained in the abbreviations on page 2. And then you are done with your answer. We'll talk about blocking and weaving in ends at the very end of this video, but what I do want to talk about is if you want to knit more answers with stash that you have, because we all have some special skeins. So you could knit the answer with any weight of yarn that you'd like to. If you have lace weight, fingering weight, sport weight, DK, worsted, etc. What you'll do is weigh your yarn before you start knitting your answer, and then start knitting with the left wing, remembering that you're only going to work with beads if you're working with fingering weight yarn because they're not going to fit on heavier weight yarns. And you will work until you are basically halfway through your skein of yarn. So if you start to weigh your ball of yarn as you see it starting to diminish, you'll want to get to the halfway point of that original weight and then start decreasing down the other side. You'll want to make sure that you end with a row 6 before you go on to the right wing. And that is like the secret. I do have one answer on my needles right now. Let me just kind of get the other swatch, got all tied up in it, of course. I have one on my needles right now that I am knitting with 2 yarns from my stash held together. One of them is this absolutely gorgeous lace weight, hand dyed lace weight yarn that's like a silk linen that's gorgeous. And the other is a very floofy cashmere and a little bit of merino yarn. And I just kind of can hold them there so you can see the 2 colors. They were from Deep Stash and they just are vibrating against each other as I knit them together. The big difference with the not beaded answer is that the first 2 stitches of wrong side rows are slipped as well as those last 2 stitches so that you get this beautiful integrated I-cord edging along the very edge of your scarflette. I'm really excited to see what you all knit as you start to stash dive and find yarns for other answers. I hope to have this one done soon so that I can show it to you completed because I think it's going to be absolutely gorgeous with some of my shirts and sweaters for like fall and later in summer. It looks just like sumac, which I love sumac in the fall. Okay, everyone. I hope this is the answer that you've been looking for. Please tag me as you knit answers, ask questions below. Links to everything I've talked about, including the pattern, are below here. I'll give you links to my Ravelry and Facebook groups if you want to show everybody what you're knitting. It's really fun to knit together and share the yarns we're thinking about using. I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot of answers come off our needles in the months and years ahead. Thank you so much for knitting with me. Please follow my channel, sign up for my newsletter if you're not on there already. That is the way I really can tell you what I'm up to kind of week to week, what's on my needles, what's going on in life. I love chatting with you. Happy knitting, everyone.